Hi everyone. Welcome to our first Urban Information Lab Smart Cities Talk Series event of spring. Today we have Jake Taylor with us. Jake is an urban innovation technologist with extensive experience across technology and design. Originally in gaming, Jake transitioned into smart cities through the Thunderbird School of Global Management, combining his user-centric, human-centered design principles with urban planning and technology deployment. Jake currently works as the technology and design manager for Greater Phoenix Smart City Consortium, the Connective. Jake, I'll hand it over to you. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, super happy to be here. And I don't mind a small crowd because that allows us to make this conversational. So I was mentioning to Connor a little bit earlier as well. I didn't want to do any slides. I thought of the backdrop and it would just be what I'm speaking, basically. Now, what's also of interest is that this theme that I've been discussing, I'm going to change a little bit. I was looking through some previous talks here on the Urban Labs, and one of them from 2 years ago was Dr. Zhao from Stanford University, I believe, and she touched on a few of these things. So where the abstract I mentioned why we aren't catching up as US cities, she touched on the why. But now I want to focus in on the why isn't it working? If we recognize that what's not taking place to get us to that next step. So totally open to conversation. I'm also very prone to ramble and go down rabbit holes. So Connor, anyone else in the room, please feel free to drag me back in. I am also going to pick on a colleague. So joining us is Ben Williams, our program manager. So if there's any questions about the Connective at large as well, I think we'd be both happy to touch on that. But what I want to start with is a little background, because in that bio, I mentioned my background comes from gaming. Now, the reason I bring that up is because it sets a foundation for why I've really come to this point of view that I have, very much, excuse me, as an outsider, if you will, to the traditional conversation around smart cities. So, so as I timed this, I realized that my intro was way too long, so I'm going to do the power version of this. But again, Jake Taylor, super glad to be here. 10 years ago, I was in a very different industry. I was working with Nintendo making games for the Wii U platform at the time. I had gone through that. My passion was really in that user centricity. So game design very much at the heart of taking a player through a journey. And then when COVID hit, my plans and ambitions started to change and things went from one to the other. So I decided to transition. And all of these variables, again, lead to this perspective. So I went to the Thunderbird School of Global Management to get my MGM, Masters of Global Management. It's an MBA with an international focus. But while I was there, I was introduced to a smart cities program called the Citizen-Centered Smart Cities and Smart Living. That was a National Science Foundation grant through Thunderbird and Arizona State University. Now, why that attracted me, and for the life of me, I cannot remember the phrasing that they used, but there was a tract in that fellowship specifically around gamification of urban centers and cities. And that really appealed to me. I come from an area that's not at the forefront of technology. To take an antiquated system that focuses on fines and punishment as the only means of behavior control and take a gamified approach was fascinating to me. So that was my master's thesis. That's what I went through, looking at how can we create behavioral incentives through smart city programs via different mechanisms. But anyway, all of this is to say is that I came into this smart city dialogue very, very different background. For example, when you're making a game, I am sitting at the table with a sound designer, with my head of engineering, with an artist, 3D modeler, animator, sprite creator. I'm working with QA teams. Half of us are around the world. I am very used to being at a table with a lot of different perspectives. And I imagine in programs like these, we have a large engineering focus. If you've ever sat down with an artist or a musician, you're probably used to not speaking the same language. I don't mean coding language. I don't mean English, Spanish. I mean the way you tick is completely different. And that's the reality of game development. So when I came into smart cities, which as Dr. Zhao mentioned as well, a very multidisciplinary subject, or it should be, but it's often not. So for example, when I was going through that National Science Foundation program, I was the first, one of five of the first cohort of non-engineers in this program. They recognized the need for this multidisciplinarity. And so they brought in some different folks, public administration background, business background, education background. And at one point in time, there was an individual that was really dissatisfied with that. She was an engineer and said, I do not understand why we have so many business people in this program. And that was my first introduction to this real isolationism, if you will, thought isolationism, or at least the tendency to self-silo. Now, that's a term that I'm sure comes up constantly. I try not to use it, but it will come up a little bit. But anyway, suffice it to say, I come in from a background where I'm used to collaboration. I'm used to having very, very different thoughts at the table, and we try to tackle a problem. And once I segued into this world, it's not what I found. So now what I do at the Connective, we're the Greater Phoenix Smart City Consortium. We work with the city leaders, city managers, sometimes elected officials, but often CTO, CIO level. We work with them in identifying solutions for active problems that they have. Now, one of the big things that I was going to go into today is this shifting landscape, that this is not really tech-centric anymore. It's not being led by the Honeywells, the IBMs, but I'm discovering that for you, that's all news, and that's great, because now we can really go in and focus on well, now that we've recognized the problem, what is left to shift, right? If we've identified the path, why are we still floundering and really connecting a lot of these dots? So anyway, what's the point of all of this? What does this have to do with why US cities are falling behind on the game? Now, there's three main points that I'm going to come in here. And again, I'm going to go back, dialogue, super open. Cut me off anytime if there's anything we want to dive into. I have not really done this specific subject as like a speech before. This is something that I'm really formulating, and this is a fantastic platform for me to refine that thought process with all of you. But the 3 points I want to look at is that landscape that we're talking about. But now, since we can move forward, it's what's working, what's not. Some of it's changing, some of it's not. I really want to identify that piece that's holding us back. The other is that multidisciplinarity, but moving from strictly multidisciplinary teams to multidisciplinarianism. We are lacking the mindset. We understand that the teams need to be cross-functional, but we have not yet integrated it into our systems. And the last is what I call civic isolationism. That one's hard to describe without really diving in, so that's where I'm going to start. We're going to go right into that one. So as an outsider, I mentioned Thunderbird. For those of you who aren't familiar with Thunderbird, it's a school that has massive impetus for international. It's not just business, it's public affairs, it's trade, whatever it might cross borders is what they touch on. So naturally, as I'm going through a smart cities program in this kind of international environment, I slapped those two together and I got really, really interested in that global stage of smart cities. And as I've seen here, even in urban labs, and forgive me if I'm getting the name of the whole laboratory wrong, but you do look at the case studies of Seoul or Taiwan, Taipei, whatever it may be, Helsingborg, Tampere. But as I've settled into this role at the Connective and I start to talk with city leaders, that's really not the case. They're not looking and saying, hey, what did Boston do? Or hey, what did London do? They're saying, hey, we're Phoenix. What's Chandler up to? They're 10 miles down the street. What are they doing? Oh, they haven't done AI yet? Okay, we're good. Really fascinating way that we, in terms of regional geography borders, condense our thinking to that which is around us. So again, Seoul, we know, has done fantastic things. Singapore, digital twins, great example. These are case studies that we should look at. But instead, I talk with folks at Los Angeles and they say, oh, we're LA, we haven't done a twin yet. No one has. We haven't done it, no one has. It's a very special kind of hubris. And I don't mean specifically LA, I'm not picking on that city, but this idea that we still have this idea that we should be the forefront. So a lot of the city leaders I talk to, they want to be pioneering, they want to be cutting edge. So I talk to them and say, okay, well, let's see if someone else will do it. Now they become fast followers, or they want to be fast followers. But the reality is the project that they're trying to initiate has already been done 10 years ago or longer. Not only are we not fast followers, but we're critically behind. And what's fascinating is that I think we're finally starting to recognize that. About 2 months ago, I had a conversation with one of the prominent cities, and they said, guys, we recognize that we are behind on this. And so that tide is starting to change, which is great. But what is the extended effect of this? Why is it bad to be regionally focused, right? So I don't know the whole Austin area superbly well, but I know it's made up of a lot of cities and towns. All metro areas are. So if the city of Austin isn't looking at other areas, or city of Phoenix, and is simply looking at what's Rolling Hills do or Rolling Rock, what are they up to? Regional's not bad. We have shared problems, but not in all cases. So let me scroll over here, get my notes back down. We talk about breaking silos. I promised I wouldn't use that word too much. But when you're not looking beyond the mark, when you're not looking outside of your region, you have cases like this. So a few years ago, we found that the Phoenix Police Department had just invested about 1.5 million on drone technology. Fortunately, it wasn't the kind of big brother stuff, but it was in a hostage situation, and we can't get to the window to see if the person is safe. Could that be a function for drones to get closer and verify the situation? Great use case. The self same year, Phoenix Fire Department put in around 1.5 million for the exact same technology. That is a redundancy that should not exist, but it does. And if it's existing in the same city, it's happening in the region, it's happening in the country, it's happening on the global stage. All we've really done, as we've talked about the silo problem for the last 10 years, is created new larger ones that we play ball in. And this extends to point number 2, which is this idea for interdisciplinarianism. We know that we should all be at the table, but what we've really done is, let's pick on academia for a bit, sorry. You do something, you come up with a great solution, you publish a paper, who reads those papers? Other academics. Those are going to other universities. You have this nice little self-contained system. And it's true of the others as well. Your startup guys go to the same events, or startup folk, whoever. Your government people go to the National League of Cities. Everyone has their own little club. They've branched out of their bubble, but that bubble is just other bubbles just like them. And it creates for a very interesting dichotomy where we think we're branching out, but at the end of the day, we're just in the larger echo chamber, and we're going to start to resonate with a lot of the same ideas. So like my opening kind of example of my background comes from, just like my coders are going to look at something from a certain perspective, the others are going to look at it very differently. I have a stupid little story about that. But when we were making one of our first titles, it was Gemology for the Wii U, my head of engineering had a problem. I cannot recall what it was, but he was beating his head against a wall for about 2 weeks trying to figure this out. He finally lamented and said, take a look, whatever. And for context, I don't code, right? I'm a producer, kind of background, entertainment kind of background. But I took a look at it, and while I can't reproduce C#, I am familiar enough with the logic that I was looking through it. About a half an hour later, I said, hey, check it out right here. And here we go. Developed a real knack for QA. Where I would hope he would be excited that we had overcome the problem, he was absolutely besides himself pissed. He said, I don't understand how you figure this out. And the idea is you may be the expert in the room, but you still have a point of view. And maybe you might have a non-expert, but they're going to come at it with a very different direction. Now, I won't pick on Ben to chime in. I don't even see, oh yeah, he's still here. But what makes the Connective interesting in this regard, and the final point that we'll get to, is this need for public-private interaction partnerships. He comes from a public administration background. I come from a design background. And when we engage a conversation, we cut through a lot of the fat that exists in smart cities dialogue, and we can get down to a root of a problem, navigate how government will actually go about it, and find a deployable solution far faster than we would individually. Now, the thing is, when I bring this up, I don't see any cameras on here, but I know you're rolling your eyes. I know. Every time I talk to someone, I say, hey, we need multiple people at the table. Yeah, we get it. We get it. We know. Okay, so why aren't we doing it? That's where I usually get the crickets. They say, that's a fantastic question. I really don't know why we're not doing that. Why was the engineer in my program so upset that the business folks were at the table with them? I don't actually have an answer for that one. But to illustrate, I was at a local leadership summit, and we had one of our local cities, City of Scottsdale, we had their head of economic development and their CTO. And we got to talking about that with the others in the room. And I said, raise your hand if you're an AI expert. And we did have a few hands go up. I said, awesome. Who's also a digital twins expert? I think a couple hands came back down. Sustainable mobility, carbon reduction, civic engagement, digital platform, machine learning, autonomous vehicles. By the time you get through all those technologies, you don't have any hands up anymore. And that's the reality of our current set of affairs. Technology changes so wildly, and we all understand this, that even if you do secure a expert status in one category, that's going to be insufficient for the scope and scales of modern cities. So if we are working city to city, is that enough? And I maintain no. That's where an entity like the Connective or otherwise steps in and helps facilitate those dialogues and those conversations to connect with the right set of experts. All right. So And so this segues into the next part as well. I mentioned the landscape. The structure of this used to be that your academics studied and they came up with technologies and these great new innovations. It was commercialized and industry was able to take that off. And to implement that at the urban or civic level, it went through procurement. Largely, it went through procurement. But you would be hard pressed to convince me that any academic institution today isn't also a business, or that governments have not gone into service provision, or that even industry isn't engaging in the educational sector, or all sorts of these variables. The lines that we traditionally follow are blurring. Now, we recognize this, but largely speaking, we're not playing by the new rules. Governments are still trying to procure, even though that they're trying to build it in-house, etc. So, segue into the third and final point, what is changing? What I have noticed, and Dr. Zhao mentioned this, is that procurement is no longer the impetus by which we seek to innovate in the public sphere. Especially speaking for our region, what I'm finding is, and I have some concrete examples to go with this as well, our scope and scale is large enough that their IT department or innovation department or otherwise has the bandwidth, the manpower, if you will, to start to build a lot of this in-house. Their resources match that of a startup or maybe a small lab, like we said, 20 individual lab. So where I'm going to use the city of Mesa. City of Mesa is the second largest city in our metro. So Phoenix is the behemoth. Mesa's over here to the right. It was one of the earlier suburbs. They had a need for a parking solution. Their downtown is very scant. They were looking at the parking.com, all of those kinds of things. And the bids that they were receiving were in the six figures. So here's a parking garage. It'll be about $100,000 to equip this with the right IoT for an individual to know if it's full or not, or navigate to an open parking spot. They said, that's crazy. We can't do six figures per parking garage. They went around, reverse engineer it, did themselves, roughly $6,000 per parking garage. We're talking about a penny per dollar that they are able to implement that at. Same thing, City of Glendale. Now, what they did is they partnered with an entity. Connor, this will resonate. We were talking about in-house models. They created their own individual City of Glendale LLM for civic workers. So this is not a public-facing LLM, but it's an internal tool that scours their own documents, and they can use that to find, simplify, right? This is an optimization tool that they've done. And then same, City of Scottsdale, like noise mitigation. They're trying to do it in-house. The shift that we saw that I was really glad to hear about in a previous session is that this is no longer tech-led. And I know that you know this, but the result of that is, if government is going to lead it, what else is required to be at the table to make that successful? So that leads me into two things. What's changing in the landscape? Let's start with what's not. Lean governance in the United States is still a massive thing. I'm not going to get into a debate as to whether or not there is bloat in governance, but for the most part, at the local level, we still operate on skeleton crews. City of Phoenix Circular Economies Initiative, for example, is a one-person shop. We have the innovation department is 3 or 4. We're working in small teams, so we are absorbing this desire to innovate in-house, but we have legally binding by law boundaries on how much we can really put into that. And that creates a very fascinating tension. Now, this all started 70s, 80s when the Six Sigma and other Japanese efficiencies was really taking off. We adopted that, we applied it to civics, lean governance, great. Do more with less manpower. Fantastic. But if you're trying to take over that process, you're going to have a natural limitation. Let's see. So allow them to allow them to keep a smaller staff, increase operational efficiency. But as we move away from that, let's see. That's right. Okay. So the history lesson that you already know. We know that this started with the Cisco's, Honeywell's, IBM's. They came and said, hey, here's our grandiose vision. This is what you should do. Tech for tech's sake. This is your 30-second history lesson of smart cities. But again, we know this. Now it's problem centric. So we've established two things. We're trying to do it in-house, don't have the resources to do it, and you can never be an expert by yourself. How do you alleviate that? What is the middle ground by which we can do that? And here's a few other examples I put down. So I was meeting with Google Fiber recently, and they were giving me an example of this. They had a city that said, hey, we would love fiber. We think that'd be a great tool for our citizens. Well, great. We can come in, we'll dig the trenches, but what we do is middle mile, right? You have to have a data center, and then someone has to take it from the post to the house itself. We don't dig a trench up to everyone's front door. They said, well, why not? And it's just not our business model. So great. If you as a city are trying to implement fiber, there are holes in that gap that you probably can't do alone. Another one as well is this idea of why industry isn't leading this anymore is typically it is mass produced and it's a one size fits all model. I don't want to pick on the Honeywells or IBMs of the world, but that's traditional way we do things. We have a design team, we come up with something, we identify problems as we see them, but we create a product and we deploy it. The cost to customize that to every single city is exorbitant. It's not going to happen. And yet take the city of Scottsdale again. We had a digital kiosk provider, absolutely free to the city, as long as we can have advertising signage on it. In the city charter is a clause that states there will be no digital signage of any kind. Absolutely scraps it. These are the nuances that cities have. These are giant amalgamations of people and laws and history that no one size fits all solution will ever go in there. So for the sake of time, because we will leave a little at the end, the finale is, why are we pushing for something we know, which is that public-private partnership? Singapore is the king of this, especially if we're talking about fiber. They knew that they would never be able to provide the actual, service itself. But at the same time, if you leave it in the hands of industry, it's not going to meet the needs of all citizens. Let's take wayfinding. Now, I've worked very closely with Google Maps here locally. And my favorite thing is our downtown Main Street. Ben's going to roll his eyes. I tell this example every single day. And if you Google Mexican food, it comes up with two options, Taco Bell and Taco Bell. But in reality, there's about 40 locations in there. And because industry's model does not meet the needs of our citizens, they're geared for income, and that's understandable. That's how they operate. But if we as a city want to drive traffic to our small businesses, we have to look at that and say, how do we fill in that blank? That last mile in the case of Google Fiber. How do we step in and do that? And if you're running a skeleton crew, you're oftentimes not going to have that bandwidth. So cue institutions like University of Texas, Austin, the urban labs, the Connective, partner, bring in the right partners at the table. Now, there's one last point that really resonates for me personally on that one, because again, I come from a very different background. When I stepped into this, I saw a great example. We recently got Taiwan Semiconductor here, massive, massive operation, and the number of engineers they required was insane. So they said, great, you need more engineers. Okay. Let's send all this money to the academic institution. They'll work on it. Great. They'll speak with all the industry and the suppliers to figure out what we need. Great. That comes back to Taiwan Semiconductor. Fantastic. Great conversation. All four parties connected the dots. Who was not at the table? The people. The people that they are trying to train. No one talked about lack of transportation. No one talked about affordability of the program. No one talked about the childcare requisite to upskill a staff. If we're going to design for people, we have to have people. I think that's as good a stopping point as any. And I know that this is ethereal, but I'm absolutely happy to talk more about what we do and exactly what I mean, what the shape looks like. But appreciate the time to go on a soapbox.
Thank you, Jake. We appreciate you going on the soapbox. I had a sort of question. So I guess I agree very much so that, everyone sort of has this feeling and agreement, especially in urban planning, more folks need to be at the table. What have y'all found over at the Connective, or you in past experience, sort of what have you seen successfully as far as incentivizing people to come to that table? Because, even if Dell wants to fund something, it's hard to get them there, even if the city wants to be there and in theory and in essence should want to, better its citizens, it's still sometimes incentivizing is nice. What have y'all found sort of works?
That's a really fascinating question, because at the upper echelons of industry, I don't think we've really found the right the right model. So the Dells, the Intels, the utility providers, for example, they're, I don't want to say stuck in their ways, but it's a lot harder for them to come and do something from a custom approach. Where we really had success is going into the SME category. So I think a great example is Dell and Amarillo, Texas had a really fantastic AI deployment, but they want to translate that one-to-one, where we took a partner called SETI Dynamic, which is a very small shop, but the ability to create a lot of the stuff, and take 3D printing, for example, we don't have to have this giant plastic injection anymore. You can create things at a smaller scale. And that's true of a lot of these technological solutions. I don't have to partner with Microsoft to build a digital twin. I can download Unity and create something, with the right know-how through Cesium or something to that effect. The moral of the story is we've enabled smaller companies that are more agile and nimble to do the things that the big guys could 10 years ago. And that's where we've really found success. Let's get someone in here that's hungry for work, because those guys are, those small teams are. Cities want someone with a different perspective. And the cold hard answer, the incentive, is really finagling. That's what we do. I think that we're very professional naggers in terms of getting people to the table. But it's matchmaking. So it's incentivization, sure. But are you trying to put a carrot in front of a horse that doesn't care? Or are you going to find the right party? And eventually you will.
That's an excellent takeaway from. Thank you. I really do appreciate that.
Let's see, I'm going to drop down to some other examples that I have too. You can always go through some. Oh, here's kind of a random aside. So when I was listening to Dr. Zhao, she mentioned you hear about kind of the big wins, right? You hear the Londons or the Manchesters. Manchester had their twin deployed recently, or the New York Bitcoin, whatever, blah, blah, blah. One thing I've discovered is that cities are not great at promoting their wins. So as we've kind of transitioned from this industry-led to civic-led model, a lot of people are saying, well, smart cities are dying, it's gone, no one's really doing this anymore. Well, the reality is you're just not hearing the squeaky wheel anymore. For example, Smart Cities Connect and GovTech ran articles on San Jose's AI strategy, implementing into traffic monitoring, things of that nature. Our little city of Mesa, a suburb in the middle of nowhere, did that like 8 years ago. No one knows. And really getting those wins on the table is important. And then more importantly than that, too, translating that. Great, Mesa has it. How do you put that into Chandler and Tempe and Scottsdale? How do you make this regional? Why should innovation die at invisible city boundaries? That's really the kicker here, too.
Well, if there's no other questions, I want to take a moment to thank you for your time to come join us today and chat. We appreciate it very much. And we certainly look forward to hopefully getting to partner more and work more with the Connective. I know you have a few contacts in our lab already, but certainly if you need any information or would like to hear about anything else, happy to connect more.
Absolutely. I think we are very keen to implement what we do here, there, and see if we can't make that impact. Well, thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Pigeon, she just took off, but good to see her. So.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And yeah, we'll
Cheers.